Hello, my name is Cyle Hirschfeld, and today's graduate lecture will be on the Japanese road to Pearl Harbor, which is also the title of this lecture. December 7th, 1941. It is a day which has lived in infamy. It was the day of the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces. During that attack, 2,403 Americans died, a further 1,143 were wounded, 18 American ships were sunk, 5 of them were battleships. By nearly all measures, this was absolutely a success for Japanese forces. The American forces were taken completely by surprise. The impossible gamble taken by the Japanese was clearly a success for them. However, this narrative is obviously untrue for many reasons, but most importantly, it is untrue because this attack was in fact a strategic disaster on the part of the Japanese. Let us begin by analyzing the difference between tactics and strategy. Strategy is the big picture goal. It is the ends and what those ends imply for conditions of victory in war. Strategy can involve economic issues. It can involve political issues. And on the other hand, tactics are the actions undertaken to achieve victory in battle. It's a much smaller scale. Troop movements, dispositions, things along those lines would be tactical. So in other words, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical success in that the battle was won by the Japanese. They suffered far fewer losses than did the Americans. But it was a strategic failure in that many of the war aims which had been delineated before the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese were not accomplished. What were those war aims, and how were they determined? It is necessary to turn to those events and interactions between Japanese military members before Pearl Harbor in order to establish the reasons for Pearl Harbor's ultimate failure for the Japanese. Historian R.A.C. Parker argues that Japan was faced with a decision in the 20 years preceding Pearl Harbor in order to prosper as a nation. Was it to expand by force? Or was it to cooperate with established powers as a trading power itself in order to achieve its cultural and political desires as a world power in its own right? In the 1920s, Japan chose the latter. They wished to form a peaceful alliance with other powers throughout the globe. However, it was handicapped by a few factors, which included its largely agrarian economy, a stop to its economic growth, and the loss of the United States as a reliable trading partner after the advent of the Great Depression. This led to a change in thinking on the part of the Japanese, with Japanese military leadership gravitating towards a more aggressive policy in order to secure both oil as well as hegemonic influence and independence in the East for Japan. They began with expansion into Chinese Manchuria. Ostensibly, it was for their own defense against Chinese forces, against the wishes of the liberal government at the time, setting up a puppet government in northern China and drawing the ire, though not quite the condemnation, of the great powers of the world, including the United States. This aggression from the Japanese military was emblematic of rifts which had formed both within and without the military, which found itself consistently at odds with a liberal government which promoted peaceful relations with its neighbors, especially China, as well as pitting different factions within the military against each other, especially causing strife between the army, which advocated for expansion, claiming that Japan was ready for such a step, and the Navy, which did not believe so. Of course, there were also divided factions within both the Navy and the Army, but this is generally the case. The Army desired for rapid expansion, while the Navy desired to fortify, gain strength, wait until other powers were on the decline, and then ascend. It would not serve to say that the Navy was against expansion, however. Indeed, author Ronald H. Spector, in his book Eagle Against the Sun, The American War with Japan, argues that those moderate naval officers, such as Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who we will discuss in more depth, who invade against rapid expansion in the East, did so out of not a pacifist desire or predilection, but rather because the reckless navalism of the fleet faction was likely to bring Japan into collision with stronger powers before she was fully ready for such a contest. So many naval officers believed they should wait, they should gather strength, they should bide their time. Unfortunately, that is not what happened. So inherently, we see in Japan an expansionist attitude. Even in their conservative spheres of the military, expansion was always part of the plan, with a desire for recognition on the world stage. However, this desire for expansion and recognition had been hampered by the great powers, specifically Great Britain and the United States, who had stipulated that Japan's navy could be no greater than 70% of that of the British or American navies following World War I. This was in order to maintain the status quo. The Japanese would not be on the same level as their American or British counterparts. Now, unknown to the Americans and the British, the Japanese did in fact build up their naval forces in secret, so by the time Pearl Harbor did come around, they were almost on par, at least by tonnage, but they still were not ready for this conflict. This situation, along with the continuing one in China, which saw rapid Japanese expansion built to counter Chinese nationalist forces, and had by the close of 1937 seen all of China's major ports captured by the Japanese, though major land actions had been limited by Japan's overarching desire not to bring the major powers to bear against them until they were ready. This included French Indochina, much of the Dutch East Indies, and Japan knew better than to attack these forces at that time because it would draw the full force of those powers in addition to the British and the Americans should Japan invade in order to better access the Chinese front and continue their protracted war in China. This did not, however, stop the Japanese from bullying European colonial possessions in the East, and therefore they were imminently faced with a major decision. And so it was that in July of 1940, the Japanese made the decision to join with Germany and Italy in signing the Tripartite Pact, which they did in September of 1940, believing that Germany would be able to win their war with Britain decisively and quickly, thus allowing Japanese control of the East, meanwhile keeping the United States at bay with quick and decisive victory. The idea was that if the British could not maintain their colonial possessions because their home front was under duress, the Japanese would have ample time and ample space to conquer. Unfortunately for Japan, that did not happen. Within a year, the United States was exerting economic pressure in order to force Japan out of the war, and they were exhorting other powers in the East to do so as well, such as the Dutch and such as the British. This economic pressure came in the form of major economic sanctions against the Japanese, as well as the freezing of its assets in the United States. Japan, which was in dire need of those assets to fuel their war, and they were also in dire need of the United States' ample oil reserves to fuel their war, was hard-pressed to come up with a strategy to get around this pressure. It was over the next year that Japan would develop its wartime strategy of Pacific defense, which would come about through attack. So the idea was they would expand as rapidly as they possibly could in order to push the Americans back on their heels so that a protracted war would eventually force the Americans to accept that the Japanese were willing to die in order to maintain their possessions, and thus the Americans would sue for peace. It was the plan of Admiral Yamamoto, the aforementioned conservative who feared war with the United States too early, who developed this plan. Craig L. Simmons' book, The Battle of Midway, has more to say on Yamamoto's character, but important to our purposes is his commitment to his duty despite his belief that Japan's entry into the war, especially on the side of the Axis powers, was a mistake. However, Yamamoto believed that if he was to lead the Japanese Navy into war against the United States, he would do it in style, and he would do it to the best and fullest of his capabilities. And so he picked the bombing of Pearl Harbor as the decisive engagement to derail United States capabilities in the Pacific until such time as the Japanese were resource-rich enough to face them. A preemptive strike against the United States would allow for this, and thus it was strategically vital in Yamamoto's plan and in the overarching Japanese war aims to decisively sink and destroy the American Navy before the war really began. Paramount to this was the American aircraft carrier. Yamamoto was one of the first Japanese admirals to believe in the efficacy and strength of the carrier over that of the battleship, and he knew that, well, he suspected that the carrier would be the decisive factor in a naval war. Unfortunately for Yamamoto, who was thrust into his role reluctantly, though he took to it with gusto, the commander of the famed and feared fleet, the Kaido Butai, and the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nagumo, was an inherently cautious commander. He sought to preserve his forces. He was not at all up to the brash attack for which he was paid. This failure to find a commander sufficient to the task is what led ultimately to the failure of the Japanese to knock the Americans out of the war at Pearl Harbor. Instead, Nagumo was content to hit and run, leaving vital American fuel reserves, ship repair stations, and missing aircraft carriers intact. So while, yes, many Americans died, many ships were sunk, 18 in total, 5 battleships, nothing that was decisively against the Americans occurred. And in fact, the Americans were enraged by this particular event. They were incensed. As a nation, the Americans rallied against the Japanese. So the lesson here is simple. The divided military and government had produced in Japan a conflicted strategy, one which provided an admiral in Yamamoto more than adequate for the job, and a commander, Nagumo, who was less so. What could have been a complete strategic win for the Japanese turned into a rallying cry for the Americans, who were hobbled by the attack, but by no means were they crippled, as was intended. Thank you for watching.